Before soldiers saw the helicopters, they heard them, a low thumping that grew until it filled the sky. In Vietnam, that sound meant everything: reinforcements, evacuation, fire support, or death. For the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, it was a sound they could never predict. The enemy seemed to appear from nowhere, above the treetops, behind the hills, and sometimes unbelievably from behind. American helicopters could move in ways no one expected. They could hover in place, pivot, strafe sideways, and even fly backwards, a maneuver no fighter jet or bomber could match. In 1962, when the first Hueys arrived in Vietnam, few understood how much they would change the war. Within 2 years, helicopters had turned from transport vehicles into flying weapons. They could lift troops into battle, provide air cover, and pull the wounded out within minutes. The helicopter became both angel and demon, a savior for Americans, a nightmare for the enemy. And it was only just beginning. The United States Army had studied helicopters since the Korean War, but Vietnam became their true testing ground. General William Westmoreland, then commander of U.S. forces, believed mobility would win the conflict. So, in 1965, the Army created the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, first of its kind in history. They traded horses for rotors. The new cavalry didn't ride across plains. It soared over jungles. The UH-1 Huey became the backbone of this experiment. Light, fast, and rugged, it could carry a dozen troops or sling a jeep beneath its belly. More importantly, it could land almost anywhere: rice paddies, hilltops, even bomb craters. During the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965, the world saw air mobility in action. American units surrounded by larger enemy forces survived because helicopters delivered ammunition, removed casualties, and brought in reinforcements under fire. Pilots learned that in the tight valleys of the Central Highland, maneuvering forward wasn't always possible. So they pulled back, literally backwards, keeping the enemy in their sights as they retreated. It was a strange, counterintuitive dance in the air. Engines screaming, rotors chopping, machines sliding through space like living creatures. By the end of Ia Drang, the air cavalry had proven one thing: speed and flexibility could do what numbers could not. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois, known to everyone simply as the Huey, was built around one idea: lift equals life. Its single turboshaft engine drove a 2-blade rotor capable of producing over 1,100 horsepower. The cockpit was simple, intentionally so. Big switches, analog gauges, everything reachable under stress. The Huey could climb at 1,700 feet per minute and reach speeds over 120 miles per hour. But its real power was control. Pilots could stop midair, slide left or right, pivot 180 degrees, or back away from an ambush while still firing. North Vietnamese soldiers had never seen anything like it. In their reports, they described the helicopters as ghosts that moved without rules. When one appeared low over the trees and then drifted backwards, they thought it was crippled. Then the guns opened up. Each Huey carried door gunners armed with M60 machine guns, sometimes modified for higher rates of fire. With one pilot handling flight and the other directing weapons, the aircraft became both transporter and gunship. Crews joked that the Huey was a jeep, an ambulance, and a dragon all in one. Its simplicity made it easy to repair in the field. Its noise made it unforgettable. That rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp wasn't just sound. It was psychology. It told friendly troops that help was coming, and it told the enemy to hide. As the war intensified, helicopter pilots began to improvise. There were no manuals for jungle combat at treetop level. Everything was learned the hard way, by doing it under fire. Pilots discovered that reversing the helicopter gave them an unexpected advantage. By sliding backwards, they could keep their guns fixed on a target while retreating out of range. Enemy gunners, expecting the aircraft to turn and flee, exposed themselves and paid the price. In ambush zones, helicopters often approached low and slow, hovering just above the treetops. Door gunners scanned for muzzle flashes. When fire erupted, the pilot would drop altitude, pull back, and unleash a storm of 7.62 rounds. Then, without turning, he'd climb and back away into the sky. To ground troops, it looked impossible. To the pilots, it became second nature. As one of them later said, "We didn't fly the helicopter. We wore it." In 1966 and 1967, entire tactics manuals were rewritten. The idea of air cavalry was no longer theory. Helicopters weren't just transporters. They were mobile fortresses, capable of attacking, retreating, and repositioning faster than any enemy could react. North Vietnamese commanders issued orders to hide anti-aircraft guns until helicopters committed to a direction of flight. But pilots no longer followed predictable paths. They hovered, feinted, reversed, constantly changing speed and direction. The result was confusion. Entire battalions fired into empty air, while a real attack came from a different angle. By late 1967, U.S. commanders credited helicopter tactics with preventing multiple ambushes and saving thousands of lives. But these maneuvers came with a cost. Precision demanded courage, and every mistake meant death. The next step was inevitable. If helicopters could fight while flying backwards, why not arm them properly? The first gunships were improvised. Crew chiefs welded machine guns and rocket pods to the sides of standard Hueys. The extra weight strained engines, but the results were devastating. In 1966, Bell Aircraft developed the AH-1 Cobra, the first dedicated attack helicopter. It was narrow, fast, and deadly, essentially a Huey redesigned for offense. Armed with miniguns, rockets, and grenade launchers, the Cobra became the helicopter's answer to the fighter plane. Hueys carried troops. Cobras cleared the landing zones. Together, they formed the hunter-killer teams that dominated Vietnam's battlefields. From the air, pilots coordinated like a pack. Hueys dropped infantry while Cobras orbited above, spraying fire across tree lines. Then the transports backed out, were often in reverse, to keep gunners facing the threat. For the North Vietnamese, the battlefield had changed overnight. The Americans could land anywhere, attack from any direction, and vanish just as quickly. No hill, no village, no tunnel entrance was safe. Flying in Vietnam was equal parts courage and chaos. Pilots joked that they aged a year for every mission. The jungles hid anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, and heat-seeking missiles. Dust-off crews, medical evacuation pilots, faced the worst of it. Their job was to land under fire, often in places too small for safety. Between 1962 and 1973, they evacuated more than 900,000 wounded soldiers and civilians. For every 10 missions, at least one ended in a crash or a hit. Many of them flew unarmed, marked only by a red cross. They trusted their speed and maneuverability to survive. Some didn't. Still, they kept going. For the men on the ground, the sound of those rotors meant hope. Every soldier remembered that noise, a heartbeat of rescue in the chaos. Helicopters became the soul of the American war effort. They defined its mobility, its reach, and ultimately its tragedy. The North Vietnamese weren't helpless. By 1968, they began deploying 12.7 millimeter anti-aircraft guns and captured heavy machine guns along infiltration routes. They camouflaged them under trees and near river crossings, waiting for helicopters to hover. Some of these gunners became experts at predicting rotor sounds. They learned to shoot ahead of the noise, not at it. In response, American pilots adjusted again. They approached low, then suddenly climbed or reversed course midair to break the enemy's aim. The backward slide, once just a curiosity, became standard practice. When Soviet-made heat-seeking missiles entered the war, the challenge grew deadlier. Pilots began releasing smoke grenades or flying through cloud cover to break lock-ons. Survival became an art form, half skill, half luck. Still, the helicopters kept coming. Every landing, every extraction, every dust-off mission proved that technology alone wasn't the story. It was human instinct pushing machines beyond their limits. And that was what the North Vietnamese never fully understood. The helicopters weren't just machines. They were extensions of the men who flew them. Men who had learned to make them do the impossible. By 1968, the Cobra had arrived in force. Its thin silhouette cut through the sky like a blade. Twin miniguns spun at 6,000 rounds per minute. Rockets lined its stub wings. Pilots nicknamed it the Snake. The Cobra could bank harder and dive faster than a Huey. It rolled into attack runs so steep that enemy gunners often froze before firing. And just like its older brother, it could hover and slide backward to keep targets in sight. For infantry on the ground, the combination of Hueys and Cobras was transformative. One air assault team could deploy, fight, and evacuate without ever touching a road. It was the first time in history that mobility outweighed terrain. Every morning over Vietnam, hunter-killer teams lifted off together. One Huey for transport, 2 Cobras for cover. The Cobras flew ahead, searching for ambush positions or fresh trails cut by the enemy. When they found movement, they'd mark it with smoke and circle like hawks. Then the Hueys would drop in, troops jumping into grass chest high, rotors tearing the air. If fire erupted, the Cobras reversed, covering the retreat with rockets and 20 millimeter rounds. Enemy units rarely understood what was happening. One moment silence, the next a storm from above. These teams would fly 5 or 6 missions a day, refueling from makeshift bases. The air never stopped throbbing, a constant heartbeat of war. Amid the gunfire were the unarmed, the medevac crews, call sign dust off. They carried no weapons, only stretchers and courage. Their mission: reach the wounded within minutes. Landing zones were often the same fields that had just been under fire. Pilots learned to descend sideways or backwards to reduce their profile. It looked unnatural, but it saved lives. Over 1/3 of all dust-off crews took hits from enemy fire. More than 200 pilots and medics died doing the job. Yet the average rescue time from injury to hospital was under 30 minutes, unheard of in previous wars. One commander said, "They flew into hell, so the rest of us didn't stay there. Flying by day was dangerous, flying by night was madness, still pilots did it. Infrared flares lit the jungle like lightning. Enemy fire sparked upward as red tracers arched through the dark. To avoid predictable paths, pilots invented drift patterns, a zigzag slide combined with micro-hover pulses. It let them move sideways and backward while keeping the nose toward the threat. Each maneuver burned fuel and nerve, but it kept crews alive. Helicopter fights at night became a psychological battle. The enemy never knew where the sound was coming from or where it was going. By 1970, the North Vietnamese had adapted. They built concentric rings of anti-aircraft guns around key trail junctions. Each battery was hidden under trees, connected by telephone wire, waiting for the next Huey convoy. When one gun opened fire, the others joined in perfect timing. Helicopter losses rose sharply. In response, American pilots perfected the pop-up and reverse method. Rise from cover, fire, then drop and slide back out of range before the enemy could track. The backward flight that had once been a trick became a tactic. It was never written into any manual. It was taught in the sky. Maintaining helicopters in Vietnam was a war inside a war. Humidity ate metal, dust clogged filters, engines sucked in sand. Crew chiefs worked with no sleep, stripping gearboxes by hand using parts from wrecks. One maintenance sergeant called it Frankenstein aviation, but it worked. Downed aircraft were cannibalized, rotors swapped, frames patched with beer cans and hope. The result, a fleet that kept flying long after logic said it shouldn't. In 12 years, U.S. aviation units logged over 7 million flight hours in Vietnam. No army in history had ever moved so much human life through the air. When Saigon fell in April 1975, the final chapter belonged again to the helicopter. Operation Frequent Wind, the largest air evacuation ever attempted. Over 7,000 people were airlifted from rooftops as enemy troops closed in. Hueys took off from embassy parking lots, balconies, even city streets. Pilots flew until they ran out of fuel, then ditched their machines into the South China Sea. On American ships offshore, decks overflowed with refugees and wrecks. When space ran out, crews pushed helicopters overboard to make room for the next. The war that had begun with a helicopter insertion ended with a helicopter evacuation. The circle was complete. After Vietnam, the world copied what America had built. The concept of air mobility spread to every modern army. The Huey's descendants, the Black Hawk, the Apache, the Osprey, all carry its DNA. But its legacy isn't just mechanical, it's human. For the men who flew them, the sound of rotors never left their ears. It was the sound of survival, of trust, of the thin line between life and death. In memorials across America, helicopter crews stand in their own line of honor. not because they won, but because they refused to quit. In the Vietnam War, the helicopter was more than a machine. It was a philosophy: speed, flexibility, adaptation. The enemy could own the ground. America owned the air above it. And when that air moved backwards, it rewrote how wars would be fought for the next half century. The helicopter gave us wings in a place where the earth wouldn't let us walk. The Viet Cong never fully understood how those machines moved, and maybe they never had to, because by the time they heard the rotors, it was already too late.